It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP and Chair of the COVID Recovery Group, Mark Harper, SNP MP David Linden, Guardian columnist Jonathan Freedland and The Spectator's economics editor Kate Andrews. Remember this back in 2010?
The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in the ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisers for hire.
Now David Cameron's lobbying efforts are under investigation, but Labour says a government review is inadequate. Nicola Sturgeon says she'll get another independence referendum, but will Downing Street open the door to it if the SNP win a majority? And as the pubs reopen, everyone in the UK over 50 and in a priority group has now been offered a vaccine. So can we unlock faster?
It's the lockdown that has been overwhelmingly important in delivering this improvement in the pandemic and in the figures that we're seeing.
We'll return to that in just a moment. But first of all, you will have seen all the pictures of people thronging in pub gardens and others getting their hair cut or perhaps going to the gym. So my opening question to the panel is, how did you mark yesterday in terms of the easing of restrictions, stage 2? Mark?
Well, I've been invited, not yesterday, but I've been invited by one of my fantastic constituency pubs, the Red Lion at Blaisdon, Red Hart at Blaisdon, to go and sit in their pub garden on Friday, and I'm very much looking forward to doing that. So,
a few days to go. David, what about you?
So for me, obviously, I abide the different restrictions in Scotland, so I actually had the ability to go and get a haircut last week, which was very exciting, given that my head was rapidly looking a bit more like a microphone. So a bit more of a normal day for me, but I think we'll probably come on to some of the changes that have just been announced by the First Minister in Scotland. So when I go home this week, very much looking forward to some of the new freedoms that we're going to enjoy there. Jonathan, how did you mark it, if at all?
Well, I'm in the same category as Mark in that I am counting down the days to the weekend, where I am absolutely booked in, ready to go. Didn't go for it yesterday, partly because being outside in the cold in a pub garden was not that appetising, and I'm hoping for fairer climes by the weekend.
Ah, yes, warmer temperatures. Kate, what about you?
I went to the gym last night, which was physically painful, as I probably just made it sound, but I'm going to the pubs tonight. Looking forward to it.
All right, well, you haven't waited that long. Mark, the Prime Minister has said today he's not going to change the roadmap because lockdown is overwhelmingly responsible for the drop in case numbers. Is he right?
Well, I thought the government's policy was to look at data, not dates. And of course, the fantastic news today is that we've now offered a vaccination to the top 9 groups who account for 99% of the deaths from COVID and over 80% of the hospitalisations. And they've now been protected by their first dose. So we've seen extraordinary take-up. 95% of people in those groups have taken up the vaccine. And the vaccines are very effective at preventing serious disease, hospitalisation and death. So I think if you're following the data, then yes, you could safely open up the country more quickly, because the problem with having an abundance of caution is that abundance of caution is going to mean that people will lose their jobs and businesses will fail that don't otherwise need to do so. And now we've protected the top 9 groups and are rolling out to the next group down. And I think we could safely open up faster.
Right. And I was just saying, do you agree with that, David? Because we've just heard, as you were predicting, from Nicola Sturgeon, she is speeding up the easing of restrictions, she says, because of positive data in the last 2 weeks. So you would agree with Mark?
Yeah, I think it is important that you look at the data, not the dates. I mean, when you consider that, Scotland, we've now got the lowest rates that we've had since September. Take, for example, at the end of January, we were having, case numbers of 2,000 infections per day. That's now under 300. There's been an 85% reduction since January, indeed a 40% reduction in the last 2 weeks. So when the data moves, that then means that you can move policy. And what we've announced today is a real focus on well-being, and it's because people's efforts have paid off, adhere to those restrictions. So when the data moves, so does the policy, and that's what we've seen from a responsive SNP government led by Nicola Sturgeon today.
Right. Jonathan, what's your response to the idea and pressure being put on the government from people like Mark Harper to open up more quickly?
Well, I do get the pressure because people are, desperate to get back to work and for businesses to earn money again. That's very clear. But I also do get the caution that must be now absolutely ingrained deeply, particularly in the Prime Minister, because he doesn't want to make the same mistake twice and run headlong into easing restrictions. That was the mistake he made last time, and it led to that very big second wave. The thing that obviously has changed is the vaccination, and I think they do have a task on their hands of explanation. I mean, these comments, I think just today by the Prime Minister saying it's the lockdown that's done it, not the vaccination. That is contradictory to the message they were themselves pushing out in a big way earlier this year, saying vaccine is going to be the silver bullet to change everything. And people believed that and did go and get their doses and their jabs and thought, once I've done that, we can come back out. And now the government is sort of changing the message. I get the caution, but I think they've got the communications probably tangled up.
And right, Kate, what's your response to that, particularly now, since people over the age of 45 are being invited to come forward to book a jab, which is ahead of schedule?
I think Jonathan's completely right, and I would go a step further. I'm shocked by the Prime Minister's comments today. Him and his officials have been playing an increasingly dangerous game over the past few weeks, talking down the vaccines, talking about how they're not 100% effective. Nobody ever expected 100% efficacy from these vaccines. That the UK is rolling out very effective vaccines, as Mark pointed out, that are preventing against severe hospitalization and death, is nothing short of a miracle. And for the Prime Minister to say they haven't played a role in reopening, well, that doesn't follow the data that he wants to emphasize.
Except the challenge, of course, comes on two fronts. One is about the variants, and we know today that 2 areas of London, Wandsworth and Lambeth are carrying out surge testing after a significant cluster of the South Africa variant was found. That's going to be particularly important, isn't it, Kate, in terms of consideration?
Well, it's certainly going to be important, and we should be tracing these variants very, very carefully. But so far, we are still basing this on a hypothetical. There has not yet been data that these variants can undermine our vaccines, especially when it comes to hospitalization and death. So it's not that we shouldn't take it seriously, but we should also be honest about the data we have, and it is still very positive. And when the Prime Minister says we should credit just lockdown and essentially not credit the vaccines very much, if you look at antibody prevalence in the UK now, which has skyrocketed since December, as infection rates have been falling, that can't be down to becoming infected and building up antibodies. That is down to vaccines. That is purely the vaccine success story over the past few weeks and months.
Right.
And so for the Prime Minister to play that down, I find absolutely shocking, especially as we need people to feel confident coming out of lockdown, to go back to establishments, to go back to the pub, to enjoy themselves.
Right, but it's not controversial, is it, for the Prime Minister to say it's down to lockdown, because that is the state that we have all been in. So it's impossible to tell, isn't it, too early, whether or not it has been lockdown as well as the vaccination?
I think it's extremely controversial to essentially play down the vaccines, which is what he has been doing and what he explicitly did in that comment. Of course, lockdown has helped suppress the virus. As his officials used to say, that is exactly what lockdowns do.
Right.
They suppress it. They can't eliminate it. For him to take any credit away from the vaccines, which can actually protect us from this virus, not just avoid this virus, it is very controversial, especially as we were told that vaccines were going to be that game changer that allowed us to reopen.
Well, let's see what the others think. David, is that the consideration being made in Scotland? Is it down to the lockdown rather than the vaccination that Nicola Sturgeon can now say that she wants to open up a little bit more?
I think that the two of them aren't mutually exclusive. So yes, in a situation where 60% of the adult population in Scotland have received their first dose of the vaccine, so they don't have full immunity, but there's certainly a lot more protection there. But there's no doubt that the lockdown has helped things because people have stuck to the rules and made an effort to try and follow them. And what we're seeing today is relative relaxation, but again, it's based on caution. A lot of the restrictions that we're lifting today are based on outdoor activity where we know that the risks are much lower. But I don't think it's an idea of either vaccine or lockdown. Both of them have helped. But the other important thing, and I would agree with Kate, is that we've still got to encourage people to go forward and have the vaccine. I've not had my vaccination yet. I'm 30 years old. I cannot wait for my blue envelope to come through the door. And I do think that the Prime Minister is playing something of a dicey game with his communication strategy here. But that's not always something that most of us would see as new.
Right. Do you agree, Jonathan, that it's a very controversial statement? Do you think that Boris Johnson is talking down vaccination?
I think that's the risk, that people will understand it that way, because this has been the crown jewel for the government's strategy. But let's face it, everything else in their handling of COVID went disastrously wrong, from PPE through to ventilators, through to delays. Crucially, those delays in imposing the lockdown, complacently going for reopening when it clearly wasn't ready, eat out to help out, mistake after mistake after mistake. What has been the reprieve for this government has been the vaccine rollout, and the public have sort of bought that story that is going to be what gets them out, and that, okay, they got everything else wrong, but at least they got this one crucial thing wrong. If the government then downplay how important that is and say, well, look, that's not really the game changer, you've just got to stay locked up, that treads on their own story. It's undermining for them as well as the public health messaging, because, of course you can you understand what he's trying to say, but the basic message that might cut through to people is it's not that important. And that is bad if you're trying to get people from today in England over 45s,
yes,
go out and get vaccinated.
Right. So is there going to be a backlash over his comment then, Mark?
Well, look, Joe, I do confess to being a little confused, because he also said this morning that our fantastically successful vaccination programme had saved thousands of lives, which it has. The death rate and the hospitalisation rate has fallen much faster amongst the groups that have been vaccinated. And let's be frank, the Chief Scientific Advisor has said that COVID is going to be with us forever. You can't keep the country locked up forever. So if we're looking forward to the autumn, when you're going to see more respiratory virus, that's what we see, then vaccination is incredibly important about allowing us to go back to normal. And we need to encourage everybody who's offered the vaccine to take it up, so that we can get back to normal and get the economy functioning.
So does he need to explain or revise what he said, Boris Johnson?
Well, look, I haven't seen the whole interview. I've just seen...
Well, no, but that bit's quite clear.
Yes, it is. And the problem with that logic, if you say that we've only achieved success through lockdown, the logical thing is that you just say lockdown forever, which is clearly not practical and not sensible. And it also ignores the fact that, as Kate said, these vaccines are incredibly effective at protecting people from serious disease, hospitalisation and death. We want as many people as possible to take them. I'm a bit older than David, so I've had my first jab in the proper world. I'm over 50, and we want people to get the second one, and the uptake's been fantastic. The public is getting this done. This is how we're going to get back to normal in the coming weeks.
Right.
And I think we should keep that message consistent. Get vaccinated when you get offered the jab.
Right, but just before we move on, and as you say, people now over 45 are being asked to book the jab. You wrote to the Prime Minister in February. You wanted restrictions to be lifted once the 9 priority groups had been vaccinated. You also said that the vaccines protect against death and hospitalisation, even with the various strains and variants. How do you know that?
Well, because I've looked at all the evidence. There is no evidence. The only evidence...
Well, hang on. The scientists haven't categorically said it will protect in the same way against strains and variants.
The Prime Minister himself said, the last time he commented about variants, was that all the variants that exist at the moment, the vaccines protect against serious disease, hospitalisation and death, which is what's important. Now, it is entirely possible at some point in the future something might happen to change that position. But if we're going to say that because something might happen in the future, we have to remain locked down, that is a recipe for being locked down forever.
All right.
And it isn't sustainable. The way you protect against it is you revise the vaccines, you give people booster jabs, and that's how you continue protecting people into the future. That's the government strategy, and it's a sensible one. one.
We're going to leave that discussion there and move on to the controversy around a former Prime Minister, David Cameron. This headline in the Times newspaper today, David Cameron, I'll welcome questions on Greensill lobbying scandal. The Sun has this headline, Cam Uppance probe into Dave's dodgy dealings, as they say it. Now, the government has announced an independent review into David Cameron's efforts to lobby ministers on behalf of Greensill Capital, a financial services company. Labour has already criticised it as inadequate, the remit of this inquiry. The lawyer in charge of the review will not have legal powers to compel people to give evidence, but he will be able to ask questions of David Cameron and cabinet ministers. Well, one cabinet minister was in front of a committee today, Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary responsible for some of the COVID support schemes, and he was asked about this.
Presumably, Mr. Cameron didn't lobby you, ministers or officials in the department.
I have never received a single phone call or WhatsApp from Mr. Cameron.
Other messaging platforms available, and the same for your ministers and officials as well.
As far as I understand, they haven't. But of course, we have an inquiry, as you know, and I'm sure the inquiry will get to the bottom of what exactly David Cameron, what messages he sent or which ones he received. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of that through the inquiry.
Kwasi Kwarteng there. Kate, why is this such a big story?
Well, I think it's a big story for several reasons. First of all, the coronavirus loans, the furlough scheme, those were all put forward in good faith. The idea is that only people who really needed it would use them. The idea that a company which has now collapsed had somebody lobbying the government to get these funds, and that person wasn't just anyone, it was someone in a huge position of political privilege, a former prime minister, will make people even more uncomfortable. It reaffirms, I think, the worst thoughts that people can have about these kinds of situations, that only those who are connected get support. And I think in the context of coronavirus, that's made even more painful.
Right, and it's right to have a review, Mark?
Yes, I think it's very sensible for the government to set up a review. I mean, look, a couple of things, Joe. First of all, my understanding is that David Cameron hasn't broken any rules. And of course, when ministers meet people, they have to publish details of those meetings. So it's very transparent. The second thing, though, is I think I probably agree with what David Cameron himself said, which is that he thinks, actually, on reflection, he should have only communicated with government in a much more formal way, by way of writing a letter. And he himself accepts that would have been more sensible. And I think he's probably right.
Right. Jonathan, lobbying is part of the culture that exists, doesn't it? There are rules, there is a register. If David Cameron hasn't broken them, what's the issue?
Well, the issue is that there is a kind of under-the-counter lobbying. The thing that where it's declared is if you work for a lobbying company. But if you become the in-house lobbyist, then you don't have to declare it. And people can just tell on its face that there is something wrong about a former prime minister using what was a public office for private gain. He is bending the ear of former colleagues Rishi Sunak or Matt Hancock with a view to getting what we read was a payout potentially of upwards of £60 million for himself. That is private gain pursued only because, and only possible because, he had held a public office. That's an abuse of the office. And I think Gordon Brown, who, whatever you think about his time as Prime Minister, he has been exemplary as an ex-Prime Minister, hasn't gained a penny as far as I can see from his office. I think he was right what he said yesterday, which is, there should be at least a 5-year kind of cooling off period where a former minister or prime minister and civil servant actually cannot use their office. I think, to be truthful, it should be a kind of lifetime ban for someone who was prime minister. And the reason is so that it restores public faith. Politicians are not all in it for themselves, but are doing a public job. And as long as people can coin it after they've left office, people are going to always be skeptical of those people who are in office, thinking you're only doing this decision or that appointment with an eye on your job afterwards. And that isn't healthy.
Mark?
Well, look, on the issue about the Treasury and so forth, it's been very clear. David Cameron didn't get any of the things that he was asking for, and the Chancellor has been very transparent and has published the text exchanges that he had with David Cameron, and I think he's behaved very well.
Right, but should there be a lifetime? But should there be a lifetime ban, as Jonathan has said, and as Gordon Brown raised the issue of it should be 5 years? Should a Prime Minister ever be able to, once they've left office, be able to lobby on behalf of a private company to ministers?
Well, I think you have to ask yourselves a question here, which is, what provision do you make? In the days before 2010, when prime ministers retired from being prime minister, they actually got a pension immediately in order to stop them having to earn a living outside to reflect this. That was got rid of in the wake of the expenses scandal. So if a prime minister leaves office, they do have to earn a living. If you're going to say they're never allowed to go into business or do anything, that does seem a bit silly.
All right, so you're not in favour of a lifetime ban. David, how do you see it?
No.
Well, I think this gets to the rampant cronyism that exists in this Tory government. This is not the first time that we've seen members of the Conservative Party using their contacts or indeed being in contact with their donors and seeing contracts handed out to them. And I guess that the question that I would ask is, if David Cameron wanted to be involved in the award of government contracts, then why leave the House of Commons? But he knows fine well that by leaving Parliament and phoning up his friends who are still ministers, when David Cameron's name comes up on your mobile phone, of course you're going to answer it. And that's exactly what David Cameron has been doing. But it gets to the absolute heart of cronyism within this government, and it's got to be investigated. Right,
you want it to be investigated. Should it also be investigated, then, David? The Rural Economy Secretary, Fergus Ewing, in Scotland also met Lex Greensill, the founder of Greensill Capital, for dinner. It was an unrecorded dinner. Should that be investigated too?
Well, they're two entirely different things, as I understand it. That was made aware, for example, to Scottish Government officials, and we were very confident.
Well, it was unrecorded. It was unrecorded. The Sunday Mail reports that a Freedom of Information request revealed that the minister had no officials with him, no notes were taken, and the government claims to have no emails, texts or phone records about the meeting. So you'd like to see him investigated?
Well, Fergus Ewing has reported that to Scottish Government officials. The reason that Scottish Government officials weren't at the dinner is that it would be a complete waste of taxpayers' money for officials to attend every single dinner that a minister goes to. But we're at risk of comparing not just apples and oranges here, but apples and avocados, because there are two entirely different things here in terms of what David Cameron was doing and what Fergus Ewing was doing. And I'm fairly confident of that.
Right, Mark, it's apples and avocados.
Well, they don't sound very different to me. And as I said, I think the important thing is, if you look at how ministers take decisions, if ministers meet outside organisations to discuss government business, then those meetings have to be recorded by their diary secretaries. The details of those meetings are published so that people know who you've been meeting with and why you've been meeting them. And that was something that the Conservative government, led by David Cameron, brought those rules in order to be more transparent.
Right.
And that's how people know who ministers are meeting. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's how you guard against decisions being taken for the wrong reasons.
Right. But, Kate, what impact would it have, something like a lifetime ban or at least a 5-year grace period before a former Prime Minister or certainly senior figure could then lobby on behalf of a private company?
Well, I actually think a substantial grace period would be quite successful. I mean, we have to note that David Cameron was not successful in his lobbying efforts. The Chancellor did not take the bait, but the fact that the government was put in the situation to begin with is deeply uncomfortable. So you remove that problem if you say that there is a 5 or even 10-year ban on the Prime Minister or very senior politicians being able to do this, because they have the benefits of being in politics and the huge honor and service that they get to do. They should absolutely be able to go and make a living elsewhere once that's done, but it's not obvious that they should be in such a privileged position that they can pick up the phone and make the current government quite uncomfortable with the actions of the former one. By the time you get to 5 or 10 years, you very likely are looking at different leaders, potentially completely different government, and the game has changed. But so soon after, I think understandably does make people feel like the balance of power there is off and that there's still too much connection to power to be making genuinely good business decisions.
Right. I mean, Jonathan, we've just had... Yes, you can pick up. I'm coming to you now, Jonathan, because the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has confirmed he attended a social meeting. You'll remember reports that have come out over the last few days that he had a drink with David Cameron last October and with Lex Greensill, the founder of the company. He said in the House of Commons ministers were not involved in decisions on contracts with Mr Greensill's company and that he reported to officials in the normal way following the meeting with the financier. The government announced there will be a review and he will participate in it. He said it was very important that governments engage with external stakeholders. He's got a point, hasn't he?
No, I don't think so. Really, external stakeholders means was he having drinks with with the doctors or nurses, etc. I don't think so. They were stakeholders in this business. I think the Greensill was obviously after money, and that's why. And he had this extraordinary access because he had a former prime minister as his wingman. No, I just wanted the thing I was going to pick up on earlier was just this point about transparency that Mark Harper said the Chancellor has been very transparent. I think if he was very transparent, he would come himself to the House today. Instead, a junior minister has been dispatched to do it. It's very out of character. Normally in Westminster, the most dangerous place to be is between Rishi Sunak and a camera. And this time he's suddenly got very camera shy. I don't think that speaks to transparency. And I do think cronyism of this kind, I think David was right about this, has got potential to be hugely damaging for this government. Once the vaccine bounce fades a bit, and we were talking about that before, people will look at this pattern here, where you had Robert Jenrick reducing the tax liability for a Tory donor to the tune of £40 million. You have the National Audit Office asking huge questions about how PPE contracts were handed out, this fast track, this priority lane that went to anybody who had a ministerial or official contact. We've seen the picture of Matt Hancock with the pub landlord. This does not look good. In fact, it smells rotten about this government, and there is a pattern.
Right. Let me also then pick up the idea of cronyism and transparency that Jonathan's been talking about, Mark, with the question of honour and behaving in an honourable way. There is a code, there are rules, but beyond that, you were cited in an article by James Kirkup in The Times as an example of a politician acting with honour. That was because you resigned as an immigration minister in 2014 because you learnt that a cleaner in your London flat was in Britain illegally. Do you think the rules need to change to prevent further erosion of standards in public life and trust in politicians?
Well, look, I think to some extent politicians do have to, reflect on how they behave, and I hope, and I'm pleased about what James said. I hope, when that happened, I took the view. You can only speak for yourself. I took the view that I held myself to a higher standard than we expect of other employers because I was the immigration minister, and I felt that it was therefore appropriate to stand down.
Right.
And I think people generally felt that was correct.
And do you think David Cameron has done the same and behaved in the same way?
Well, I think David Cameron himself has accepted, and I said that in my remarks, he himself has accepted that he feels that on reflection, he should have communicated with government in a more formal way by writing in the normal way rather than communicating directly with ministers. So I think he himself has reflected and come to that conclusion himself. And as I said, I think that's the right conclusion that he's come to.
Right, we're going to move on and talk about the future of the Union because the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, gave an interview to The Guardian yesterday. Let's just take a look at the headline. Prime Minister will allow second referendum if SNP wins, says Sturgeon. Scottish First Minister tells Guardian fresh poll impossible to resist should her party land majority next month. But this was the response from Downing Street covered in the Daily Mirror today. Number 10 rejects Nicola Sturgeon's claim that Boris Johnson will allow second referendum. Downing Street said it wasn't right to call for another vote on Scottish independence in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. David, Boris Johnson has said repeatedly he won't grant another Scottish independence referendum under any circumstances. Why does Nicola Sturgeon seem to think he's changed his mind?
Because what Boris Johnson says and what Boris Johnson eventually does tends to be two very different things. For example, in Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives are pushing leaflets through letterboxes telling people that a vote for the SNP would lead to a second independence referendum. And they're right, that is the case. That's why we're asking people to vote both votes SNP.
Right, but why does she think Boris Johnson's changed his mind when he has said repeatedly and emphatically that he will not grant a second independence referendum because we've had one already?
Well, clearly Boris Johnson is going to say one thing at this side of the election and something at the other, and he will have to respect the mandate that would inevitably be given to an SNP-led Scottish government if we do, in fact, win the elections in May. And the very fact that he's putting those leaflets out in Scotland saying to people that if you vote SNP, you'll get a second independence referendum, I think is a very clear concession on his part that both votes SNP would lead to a second independence referendum.
Mark, has he changed his mind?
Well, look, I think the important thing here is there's a Scottish election on May the 6th, and there's a choice for voters to make. And the Scottish Conservative position is that the next Scottish Parliament should be focused on rebuilding and getting Scotland rebuilt after the COVID crisis. That should be the priority, and focusing on domestic policy. And the Scottish Conservatives stopped the SNP getting an absolute majority last time, and they're the only party that can stop the SNP winning this time with an absolute majority. So I'd urge everyone in Scotland to vote for the Scottish Conservatives.
Well, of course you would. But as you say, until after the COVID-19 pandemic. After that, the implication of your comments are that Boris Johnson should or could consider it.
Well, no, the implication of my comments, anyone who thinks that getting the economies of the United Kingdom fixed after this crisis is going to be done in a matter of months or even a few years is kidding themselves. Getting our country, our United Kingdom, rebuilt and getting the economy back on track is going to be the work of many years. That should be the priority for the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senedd, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the United Kingdom Parliament. That should be the priority, not having another divisive referendum.
David?
Well, I find it rather rich that, the Conservative Party somehow think that because there's a pandemic on, the constitutional politics should just be put to the side. I don't recall, for example, the deal on, for example, Brexit, the trade deal. There was certainly no distraction for the UK government. We're very happy to go ahead with that. Fact is, Boris Johnson went into the 2019 election with a very clear campaign message of get Brexit done. Boris Johnson, in some respects, is a good communicator, and he will surely respect the fact that we are going into the elections on the 6th of May with a very clear message to say, to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands, not Boris Johnson's. And he knows fine well that when people go out and cast both votes for the SNP on the 6th of May, that his position will be completely untenable, and that's why we are very certain that his position will change in that front.
Right. I mean, Kate, do you detect a shift in tone or emphasis at all from the once-in-a-generation statement that the government has always stuck to?
I don't see a shift in tone yet, because I think it's truly the last thing, perhaps from another lockdown, that Boris Johnson wants is to have this referendum go ahead. But I'm inclined to agree that the results in early May could well influence things one way or another. I think it becomes increasingly difficult in Westminster to deny referendum when there have been multiple votes in favour of a party or multiple parties that support independence. And that's a separate question for whether or not it is the appropriate amount of time, whether or not this is what people were sold when they had their last referendum. We were told it was once in a generation. It does seem to be being undermined by those who would support a referendum from independence again, but that's almost a separate point from the way that people decide to vote in early May. And Boris Johnson, I think, is going to have to, at some point, listen to that result of a democratic vote.
Right. I mean, Jonathan, you'll remember on the Andrew Marr show, well, if you don't, I'm going to tell you, on the 3rd of January, that the difference, Boris Johnson said, is that we had a referendum in 1975. We then had another one in 2016. That seems to be about the right sort of gap.
Yeah, I think of little else but that Andrew Marr interview. It's permanently in the front of my mind. No, I think that, of course, that would be their preferred position. The trouble is that you get mandates in multiple ways. And if the SNP and perhaps even their allies committed to a referendum win an overall majority on a very clear platform saying, give us this mandate and we will press for a second referendum, it's very hard for him to then reject that and simultaneously, call himself a Democrat, particularly if he himself, and we just heard from David the kind of Tory messaging, if they themselves are saying the only way to stop a second referendum is to prevent that majority, well, then logic says if they get the majority, there will be one. So he is actually doing the SNP's work for it by saying a win on May the 6th will be that mandate. The problem he has is partly because of Brexit, that when there is a mandate, you have to honour it. That was his message all the way through after 2016. But the second problem he has is that he is uniquely ill-equipped and unsuited to win such a battle. Whatever his popularity in England, he is deeply unpopular, a sort of almost toxic figure, I think, north of the border, and will really struggle to win a referendum campaign. So I think that's a big problem, particularly for him.
Well, let's put Mark to respond to that.
Well, look, I think before an election, you need to focus on the choice in front of people. And as I said, I think the right thing is to focus on the priority of the Scottish Parliament ought to be, and this is the message from my colleagues in Scotland, ought to be focused on rebuilding after the pandemic, getting the economy sorted out and people's jobs and livelihoods, and actually focusing on the domestic policy that the Scottish Government is responsible for, where it's falling short on getting education sorted out, for example, getting more teachers in schools. That should be the priority. That's the message that we're landing through.
Well, I need to let David... All right, I need to let David respond briefly because we're going to move on, and also to say that we'll be speaking to all the other parties over the course of the campaign. David.
I think Mark's right to talk about rebuilding after the coronavirus pandemic, but the key question is, who is it that does the rebuilding? And this election fundamentally comes down to, who do the people of Scotland want to determine their future? Do they want it to be a government that they vote for in Edinburgh? Or do they want it to be Boris Johnson and a party that hasn't won a majority election since the 1950s? So the only way to ensure that we have Scotland's future in Scotland's hands is to both vote SNP on the 6th of May. And allow the people of Scotland to rebuild after coronavirus.
We'll leave the campaigning there. I want to refer to, Jonathan, your article in The Guardian, because you mentioned Brexit, and you're talking here about the consequences of Boris Johnson's careless Brexit are playing out in Belfast. And viewers will know, no doubt, that there have been at least 7 or 8 nights of violence in which Brexit has been partly, according to reports, to blame. But why do you say that? Why is it about Brexit?
Well, so this is the link a bit with Scotland. It does make it rich for Boris Johnson to speak about the preciousness of the Union, given how reckless, and you're right, the word I used there was careless, he has been about the Union. And that's just simply this. The Northern Ireland Protocol has put a border down the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that, therefore, is interpreted, certainly by Unionists and Loyalists in Northern Ireland, as a change in status, as a breaking of the link that binds Northern Ireland into the Union. And the result is a disaffection and anger. The whole, and I wrote in that piece, a whole variety of causes, but disaffection and anger are partly about the idea that Brexit has broken that link, and it was always going to do it to one of the two communities.
Kate,
in the end, he's chosen that one.
Is Brexit to blame?
Well, the protocol is far from perfect, but I think the interpretation of the protocol is the real sticking point now. In the European Union and the UK, both should be very motivated to sort this out and to take the loosest and most generous interpretation to make sure that goods and services and the rest continue to flow freely. Because the big difference between Boris Johnson's Brexit and the one put forward by Theresa May is that in Northern Ireland, the Assembly will actually get to decide on whether or not they're happy with these circumstances in a few years' time. There is going to be a democratic vote. I think that's a crucial part of this protocol, but so far the EU and the UK are uninspiring when it comes as to why people might want to keep this intact. So they really need to get their act together, and soon, given all that's at stake.
Right. Was it really thought through, Mark, in terms of the consequences of the Brexit without some sort of alignment on things like agri-foods?
Well, look, first of all, I think it's way too simplistic to suggest that the troubles on the streets we're seeing in Northern Ireland is entirely due to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's much more complex than that. And I think actually the government's going to have to get involved with our partners in the Irish Republic to sort this out. But on the protocol issue, I do think that both sides, so the United Kingdom and the European Union, need to make this much lighter touch. It can't be right that the vast majority of checks that are done anywhere in the European single market are taking place that stem from the Northern Ireland Protocol. That isn't light touch. It isn't proportionate.
All right.
And I think there does need to be some work done on that to make it much less of a problem for both communities in Northern Ireland. OK, meetings are carrying on this week, I understand. Now, look, at the beginning of the programme, we talked about going to a pub garden, getting our hair cut. There is still the issue, though, of how large-scale events can be held safely. The government's launched a pilot scheme to look at ways of hosting big crowds at venues like football matches, and one of the ideas is around mass testing. We can speak to George Wood, who is the managing director of the Luna Cinema. It's an outdoor cinema company operating in the UK. They're taking part in the government's events research programme and piloting event. Tell us about that event. It's a lot of people at the end of April, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we're going to be hosting 3 nights of open-air cinema in Liverpool on the waterfront. And you're right, it's designed as a pilot event, a chance for us to host members of the public at these events where the effects of the events can be tested. So the scientists can actually gather the data that will hopefully be used to support the unlocking of the country and the restart of the events and entertainment industry this summer.
Right. How will it actually work in practice?
In practice, the way that we understand it's going to work is that each attendee will take a lateral flow test before they come in the 36 hours before the event. That negative test will then be used as their ability to actually attend the event. So they can then come to the screening. In our instance, it's an open-air cinema. They can sit next to each other without social distancing. And then after the event, they will be invited to take a PCR test. And the data from that will be able to measure what the impact of hosting these live events is. And of course, the whole of the events and live entertainment industry is desperate to come back to full capacity this summer. So we're hopeful that taking part in these pilot events is the chance to do that.
Right. And this is obviously about mass testing, which you've explained very clearly. You're not taking part in anything around a vaccine passport as such, that you would have to show that before you got entry.
That's right. It's nothing to do with any form of vaccine passport. And actually, your vaccine status will have no bearing on your ability to attend these events. And that was a point that I think over the last week has perhaps not been made clear enough, that actually it's nothing to do with any vaccine passport. This is purely the chance to test what the community effect is of live events. And whether you've been vaccinated once, twice, not at all, actually has no bearing. You'll still have to take a lateral flow test, and it's that negative test that allows us to start the event from zero, from base point.
Right, stay with us. David, your response. Good idea on mass testing before entry into large events, but what about the idea of a vaccine passport?
Well, firstly, on testing, I'm very keen to see as much testing as possible. But on the issue of vaccine passports, I would certainly be very reticent about them. I mentioned earlier on in the programme that I've still not had my vaccine yet. It'll probably be some time before I get that. And I'm really going to turn around to people and say that because you've not had a vaccine yet, that you can't therefore get a vaccine passport. There are also much wider questions as well. Would a vaccine passport be if you've had 1 dose, 2 doses? Would it be if you've had a booster jab? And then further to that, I think there's the issue of young people as well. The vaccine, as we know, is only licensed for those that are under 16, but many concerts, for example, I think even Glastonbury allows people under 15 to attend. So there are lots and lots of questions about data privacy as well. So it's for that reason I'd be very reticent about the idea of going down the route of domestic vaccine passports.
Well, let's go to another young person. Kate, your view. We haven't got much time, unfortunately, but I will get round to all of you. Yes to mass testing before you can get entry into an event like Luna Cinema. What about your thoughts on vaccine passport?
Well, thanks for classifying me as young, Joe. I'm not sure anymore, but that's made my day. Look, I think it's very interesting to see the data that's going to come out of these trials, but fundamentally, we can't separate this idea of mass testing before events or going into a pub or whatever it may be from vaccine passports, because what the government has announced they're looking at is a COVID certification scheme, which could include testing in that, not just your vaccine status, but your test status. And eventually, this would all be digitized and you would carry it around with you. And I think the civil liberty implications of that are just absolutely massive. We're not even talking about ID cards. We're talking about a biosecurity card where your health information is uploaded and shared. And we're talking about using the NHS app. Now, the public was quite rightly sold that app on the idea that it would help to trace COVID in the community, but it would be completely private data. Within a matter of months, they're talking about having us share that status with a host of hospitality or mass events that we might want to attend in the future. It shows how quickly the goalpost has shifted. And so I'm very nervous about how all of this might come in.
Briefly, Jonathan, your view?
Well, tests seem a good solution to the problem David has identified, which is it's unfair to bar people who haven't had a vaccine when people like David have not even had the chance to have a vaccine. So that seems a way around. The thing I would just say is we're talking about events and concerts and pub gardens. The big issue, it seems to me, for young people, many young people, is still no clarity about universities and when they can go back, and many still saying that actually they can't go back to in-person teaching. This seems extremely unfair while we're focusing on live events, etc. Kids need an education. They're paying for it. They should be getting it.
Right. Well, Mark, do you think vaccination is obviously liberating and should be applauded? What's wrong with vaccine passports?
Well, I agree with what David and Kate have said about that. I mean, the real question, Joe, comes back to the discussion we were having at the beginning of this programme. The government used to say that once you'd vaccinated people and you protected them from serious disease and hospitalisation, that was how we were going to get our freedom back. And once we vaccinated the whole population, the whole adult population, I think the government needs to explain why that doesn't deliver sufficient protection for us to go about our lives as we would hope to normally.
Well, and we ended how we started on this subject. George, thank you very much for joining us, joining the programme and explaining the project in Liverpool. Goodbye from us.